It is Election Day in the state of Virginia, the most closely watched race of this year. Ralph Northam, physician, VMI graduate, Democrat, at this hour, 58% reporting. He is at 51%. Ed Gillespie, former Republican Party head, he is at 48%. Numerically, fairly close, but Northam in the lead at this hour. Of course, we're going to bring you the results as we get them minute by minute. We've got breaking news here. Okay, we are now reporting that Ralph Northam has won the Virginia governor's race. Ralph Northam, the Democrat, beating Ed Gillespie with 58% in. We are projecting that he is the winner tonight. So we will bring you more detail on that. And if, I don't know if we can, Kristen Fisher is live at the Ralph Northam headquarters right now. Kristen, are you there? We're going to get to Kristen Fisher in just a second. I don't think we have official statements from either campaign. But as we just said, we are now declaring or acknowledging the declaration that Ralph Northam is the winner in this race. And it looks like by about 3 points. Kristen Fisher, I think, is standing by at the Northam headquarters in Virginia tonight. Kristen? There she is.
There you have it right there. Big cheers coming out of this crowd of Northam supporters after it's announced that he just won Virginia's race for governor. This is a tremendous relief for Democrats, especially after what happened in 2016. You know, even though Northam was up in the polls, it was close, it was tight, and what happened in 2016 had them very, very concerned that they couldn't trust the polls, and it also, they were very kind of psychologically nervous that they wouldn't be able to pull out a win in a state, even though it's been turning increasingly blue. And this part of Virginia, especially northern Virginia, right on the outskirts of Washington, D.C., has been turning increasingly Democratic in recent years. Hillary Clinton won this state by 5 points. And now Northam has just done the same. You know, voting turnout has been surprisingly high here today, even though it's been a very rainy day. It's also been a non-presidential year, obviously. So despite all of those factors, voter turnout was up. Democrats were hopeful that that would lead to a win for them, and it just did tonight. As for Ed Gillespie, I'd imagine it's a much far less sour and somber scene over at his headquarters tonight. You know, he really came so close, did far better than most people expected him to do. He really tried to tie himself to President Trump's agenda. He campaigned hard on immigration, on crime. He hit his opponent very hard. And in the final days of this campaign, Northam hit back a bit. There was that ad that we've been talking about so much, which outside the campaign, which showed a man in a pickup truck with a Gillespie bumper sticker on the back, chasing down minority children. That has led to one of the most bitter elections, the most bitter campaigns in recent memory, Tucker. But tonight, Northam pulled out the win that he needed to win. Back to you.
Kristen Fisher at Governor-elect, apparently Governor-elect Northam's headquarters. Thank you very much. We're going to go back to Britt Hume, who's standing by for what this means. I was struck watching this race, Britt, by how little of it was about economics. Typically, governor's races have a lot of tax questions, for example. This one, the Northern campaign, heavily financed by outside spending on guns, on abortion, on immigration, basically on progressive social issues. Is that the template going forward, do you think, for Democrats?
Well, bear this in mind, Tucker, that Ed Gillespie and later on Donald Trump himself tried to make the Virginia economy an issue, but the Virginia economy is pretty good. And of course, so much of it is dependent on government spending, because you got that whole Hampton Roads area down there, which is military. And then you've got this vast array of suburbs on the Virginia side of Washington, D.C., heavily populated by government workers. The whole Washington, D.C. economy has been largely recession-proof. So the economy was doing pretty well even through the recession, and it has done well since. The never-ending growth of government is good for the Washington, D.C. area economy, and as I say, so much of the Virginia vote comes out of those suburbs there. It's also worth perhaps, Tucker, discussing how we now know, or believe we know, that Northam has won this race. In addition, of course, we have the exit polls which suggest that the issue profile tended perhaps to favor him. But in addition, there are about 2 to 3 dozen precincts around the state that, if you get a handle on how they're going, will tell you how the state is going. And one report I just looked at said that there were about 30 they were looking at, and 20 of them had come in, and Northam was leading everywhere. And when you see something like that, that's how a decision desk makes a decision to call a race, which is evidently what we have done here. It looks like that the political gravity, the unpopularity of Donald Trump, and the out year, the fact that this is an off-year election with the first term in office has won this race for Ralph Northam. It would have been a shocker if he hadn't won, but it appears now that he has. An important win for Democrats in Virginia.
Yeah, I think the majority of DNC employees were working on this race. DNC put in over $1 million into it, and then $1 million spent by outside groups. I just saw our research today showed that Northam won federal employees, as you noted, a huge constituency in Virginia, by 17 points. I guess that's probably not too different from the presidential results. But it seemed like turnout, and we'll know much more about this tomorrow when the smoke clears, but it seemed like turnout was profound in Democratic districts. What do you attribute that to?
Yeah, I think that. I think that's in considerable measure the Trump factor. Trump stirs passions, and the people who are for him are passionate, and the people who are against him are passionate. In the state of Virginia, remember, he lost Virginia. It's the only southern state he lost, really. So, you think about that. This is not, Virginia really isn't Trump country. And an aroused electorate in Virginia is going to be bad news for a Republican running in the age of Trump.
It's hard to see Ed Gillespie as a but I think of Ed Gillespie as we ran the Republican Party, not a party that was pretty hostile to Trump. Going forward, again, the question for the midterms is what lesson do Republicans draw from this? And it seems like it could go either way.
Well, maybe, but I mean, if you look up a mainstream Republican in the dictionary or the encyclopedia, you might find a picture of Ed Gillespie.
Well, exactly.
He is very much he's very much a creature of the Republican Party and a pretty mainstream guy, which is why I think that some of the things, the criticisms I've seen from him from some on the left, that he's a white supremacist, are patently ridiculous. But that grew out of the fact that he made Confederate statues and his desire to preserve them in place an issue and so on, and the MS-13 gang, all of that. Social issues, perhaps, historical issues, but not the mark of a white supremacist. But I think when you look at this, this was not a race that figured very well for the Republicans to win. On the other hand, if you're Donald Trump and you look at this, you think, well, I suppose some Trump supporters will say he didn't give us the 100-proof, full-bore Trump agenda or the Trump platform, but he pretty much did. On the issues, there was much daylight between him and Donald Trump. And he didn't personally embrace Trump. But the thing that a lot of people forget here, Tucker, is that when you look at the Republican Party and what it's basically stood for over the last quarter of a century and more, it has been basically the agenda that Trump has embraced as president, the legislative agenda, the regulatory agenda, and the national security agenda. So that's where all this kind of comes out. There's not that much daylight between the Republican Party and Donald Trump, and the question tonight is whether Trump drags the party down, or whether whether members of the party don't get close enough to him to get the updraft. I don't think there's a very good case for an updraft tonight.
I'm just hearing right now the Fox News decision desk is projecting that Democrat Phil Murphy will be the next governor of New Jersey. Britt, not at all a surprise there. Chris Christie, certainly among the most unpopular governors in the state, and all of our research today on this, in effect, exit polling that we did, suggested that voters were mad at Chris Christie and that anger was informing their voting.
Chris Christie leaves office highly unpopular, deeply unpopular, and look, let's be clear. New Jersey is a bright blue state, so any Republican running in New Jersey is running uphill, and almost any Democrat is running downhill. Downhill wins most of the time.
So, I mean, would you look at these two? I think you probably take New Jersey off the map because it's, as you said, it's a historically Democratic state and it had a historically unpopular governor. But the Virginia contest seemed a more ideological contest. Is that something, looking at it, if you were running the Republican Party, that would make you nervous about the coming midterms?
Well, to the extent that Donald Trump's unpopularity in Virginia, which was pretty strong, his approval rating was, it's not the worst it is anywhere, but he was way underwater in Virginia, down in the 40s, I guess, and of course nationally he's down in the high 30s, according to most of the polls. That's what has to worry you going into next year, is, you know, you've got an unpopular president. Unpopular presidents are always a drag on the incumbent party ticket in a midterm election. That is likely to be true next year. Many people say, you know, in polls, you ask these questions about than he does. So you look into the next year and you hope, for example, that they can get a tax reform and tax cut passed. You hope they may be able to recover in some measure on Obamacare if you're a Republican. But you worry about the fact that legislatively there's not been a lot of big achievements. There have been a lot of little ones on regulations, which are not inconsequential, but they're not the kind of things that catch voters' eyes necessarily. And you look at his personal unpopularity, and you know you may be dragging a big, heavy weight into the 2018 midterms with control of both House and Senate at stake. So it's obviously worrisome to the extent that this race looks like it was badly affected from the Republican standpoint by Donald Trump. You'd be worried about that.
I spoke to a member of Republican leadership recently who said, if we don't get this tax bill through and signed, we can kiss our majority goodbye. Hard for me to know whether that was overstatement or not. Do you think that? Do you think that this tax plan is pivotal to Republicans keeping the majority?
Well, here's the way I would look at that, Tucker. Taxes are perhaps the signature Republican domestic issue.
Right.
If they fail on that, then what's the rationale for them? That's the signature issue. If you're a Trump voter and you think he's doing a good job and you think his agenda is the one and his party fails to pass it, that's what leads to the perception that Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell are the problem and ought to be got rid of. So that's a chunkier base that falls away from you if you're a Republican, right? And if you are a mainstream Republican and you see that under Trump's leadership, you couldn't get that signature issue in place, that signature promise kept, then you're disaffected as well. So that's a double whammy, really, if you think about it, against the Republicans. They cannot, in political terms, they can't afford to fail on this. And of course, they're so fractious these days. Now you got people coming out all over the place saying they can't support it. You know, Jim Lankford, who's a pretty steady customer as a Republican senator from Oklahoma, pretty conservative. He's complaining about that it's going to add to the deficit and so on. And of course, you got the never-ending claims of Democrats that no matter how you structure it, they're going to say that it's a tax cut that favors the rich. Well, that can be a telling issue. Since the rich pay most of the taxes, it's pretty hard to cut them without helping the rich. But that's a political reality Republicans have been dealing with for a long time. They need to deal with it this Tucker.
As you can see from our screen, we're reporting that the Democrat, Ralph Northam, has just won the Virginia governor's race. Democrat has also won in the state of New Jersey. We're assuming that Bill de Blasio remains mayor of New York. We'll have updates on all of that throughout the hour. David Frum of The Atlantic magazine is an unbelievably smart guy, probably one of the smartest people in Washington, way smarter than you are. So smart, he qualifies as a wonk, which is another way of saying that David Frum understands policy details you never dreamed existed. He's an expert. So naturally, when Devin Kelly murdered 26 people in a Texas church over the weekend, David Frum came forward almost immediately with a tidy solution to mass shootings like this one. Frum shared it, as wonks tend to, on Twitter. Quote, "Crazy he thought. Lifetime gun ban for anyone who raises a hand against a woman or a child, end quote. Wow, that's brilliant. So brilliant that it's been federal law for 21 years. Good job, David Frum, though you're a little late to the policymaking party. Under existing statute, Devin Kelley was not allowed to buy the gun he used. Kelley had been convicted of brutally abusing his wife and infant stepson and received a bad conduct discharge from the Air Force for doing it. Even before that, before his conviction, Kelley had escaped from a mental hospital. All of that clearly disqualified him from purchasing firearms. Unfortunately, incompetent government clerks did not supply that information to the correct federal database. The laws were on the books. The bureaucracy botched it. So what are the lessons of all of this? That the NRA has too much power? That's what they're telling you on cable news and at congressional press conferences this week. But wait, Devin Kelley wasn't an NRA member. The armed citizen who stopped him was. He'd been trained by the NRA in marksmanship and gun safety, and thank God for that. So maybe there's another lesson here. At every turn, the people who claim they will protect you failed. They didn't stop Devin Kelley. They let him buy a gun. Instead, the hero of this story is a middle-aged plumber named Stephen Williford. He ignored basic human instinct and ran toward the sound of gunfire to save people. Williford, by the way, was armed with an AR-15. That's exactly the sort of rifle we've been told must be banned for our sake, to keep us safe. Yet Williford shot the murderer twice with that rifle and later chased him in a car until Kelley ran off the road. Only after the rampage was over did the police arrive, and by that point, Kelley was dead. It's an amazing story, but it's not exceptional. About 70% of mass shootings end within 5 minutes. The average police response time, by contrast, 11 minutes. And yet, for some reason, the usual establishment mouthpieces are still giving us the same stupid instructions in case of emergency. Take cover. Call authorities. No thanks. It's pretty clear that doesn't work. Now, we're not attacking the police, by the way. We're just acknowledging you are on your own. Your safety is your responsibility. That's the iron law of life. It never changes. So why is the modern left still telling us that we have no right to protect ourselves? Why are people who have taxpayer-funded bodyguards demanding that the rest of us disarm immediately? We could speculate about motive, but what's the point? They're either lying or they're stupid. It doesn't matter. Either way, they are wrong. Ignore them. Mark Glaze, the former executive director of Everytown for Gun Safety, and he joins us tonight. Mark, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
In addition to being a horrifying tragedy, the shooting on Sunday seems to blow up every basic assumption of gun control. So it was the government that allowed this to happen. Existing gun laws would have stopped this, but they weren't enforced because the bureaucracy is incompetent. And the only person who rode to the rescue is a private citizen armed with a gun that you guys would like to ban. So why doesn't this make you rethink your life's work?
Well, first of all, I'm really glad that guy was there. I think everybody ought to stipulate that it was good that a good guy with a gun happened to stop this guy. But there have been 377 mass shootings this year in the United States. Right. A good guy generally is not there. Plus, if you ask police chiefs whether it makes sense to have more guns in a shootout rather than fewer, almost inevitably, even if there's a good guy with a gun, it's civilians that they end up shooting because these are confusing situations. Better to go upstream and make it harder for everybody to get assault weapons than it is to rely on a good guy.
It would be interesting for you guys to do, I know you'd never do this, but to do an analysis of accidental shootings by police departments. They're very, very common, and people are injured by them. Right, it is true. I've seen the numbers. But it doesn't change the core facts, which are these, and I just said them. In the average mass shooting, 70% of mass shootings last 5 minutes. The average police response time is more than twice that. It's not an attack on the police, it's just there aren't that many police in this country.
Right.
So asking the average person to put his life or his family's lives at the mercy of law enforcement, wait for law enforcement to come, is insane.
Well, look, I think you would concede that we basically have a choice here. You can arm everybody in the hopes that we'll shoot them out and the good guys ultimately will win more often than they lose, or you can address the fact that this doesn't happen in any other industrialized country in the world, and it's because we go upstream to the problem and make guns really hard to get. I would rather do the latter.
But it's actually not, I mean, it's a huge assumption, as we've discussed many times, and as Angus King, the liberal senator from Maine, explained today on television, there are plenty of places with enormously high rates of gun ownership with basically no violent crime in Maine is one of them. Wyoming's another. So I don't accept your premise. But the truth is we don't have a choice because we have millions upon tens of millions, hundreds of millions of firearms in this country. And unless we take them away, and I assume you're not proposing that because you get a civil war in about 20 minutes, you have to deal with the reality of the existence of those firearms, period, don't you?
I do, and that's kind of the argument the NRA makes, which I think is a little bit ironic. They created a culture in which guns were celebrated.
Who cares about the NRA? I'm saying I'm not here on behalf of the NRA. I'm just saying that's a true point.
Yeah, but it's
so, what's the answer?
It's ironic to create a situation in which there are that many guns out there.
It's like the NRA. It's just a talking point. What do you do about the fact there are hundreds of millions of weapons? Do you want to take them away? Simple question.
I think we ought to do what Australia did.
Take them away?
I think we ought to basically have the government buy them back.
But not buy them back. It took them away.
Well, they were required to buy them back, but they did require.
Unfortunately, out of time. I wish we'd started with this. How long would it think there wouldn't be widespread violence if the government tried to take people's guns away?
I actually don't. I think most people would be good citizens and say, let's save lives.
Good citizens, yeah. Good citizens. Comply, obey, or you're not a good citizen. Yeah. Whoa. We got to do. I hope you'll come back.
Of course.
Thank you for being honest enough to admit your real agenda. I appreciate that. Authorities in New York preparing a possible criminal case against Harvey Weinstein. Will tell you what they're thinking of charging him with and assess the odds of him behind bars. We'll also continue to give you the latest results and numbers from the states of Virginia and New Jersey and other races around the country. Stay tuned.